His breath began to stink before his skin became covered with sores. By early May, when according to the apothecary's records, he stopped going down to the chapel, the servants complained that his voice in prayer sounded like a wet hiss, as if rotting flesh was scraping against bone. A week later, he ordered no one to come closer than 3 steps, but no one dared to approach him. The room where his bed stood, with its darkened icons, stank of rotten eggs, meat, and honey. The carpet under his feet was soaked with dark slime oozing from his larynx, which he bandaged with a handkerchief, changing it 3 times a day. According to reports from the Vatican, Bishop Abel of Langres, who was close to the sovereign, suspected an ominous rattle in his voice and immediately reported it to the Holy Court. Dr. Simon of Reims, summoned on the 4th day after the first signs of illness, recorded the following. In the throat area, there is swelling and tissue decay, a purulent coating adhering to the arches, a foul odor mixed with blood, and the skin on the chin is itchy and oozing. He continues to sing psalms. This prevents the wound from healing. He sang them even though his voice grew hoarse with each passing day. No one dared to forbid him. He called it his fortress of prayer. After 15 days, the mucous membrane of his throat began to peel away. Blood flowed from his mouth with phlegm. At first, the monks sang with him. Then only he sang, and then he sang alone, because the monks were ordered to leave. Someone said that one of them had heard blasphemy in the singing. The smell coming from the chambers forced the guards to board up the cracks with rags soaked in vinegar. At that time, unrest began in the capital. Rumors of the illness spread faster than expected. 2 apothecaries and a street preacher were hanged on the outskirts of the city for spreading blasphemous rumors about the rotting king. The heirs, 3 nephews, arrived secretly and were placed in the lower chambers, access to which was controlled by senior bodyguards. Even then, disputes began among them about who would be allowed to read the will if he continued to die for another month. From the diary of Jean Christian, the Chamberlain. His voice no longer sounds human. He sings even though his throat is bleeding. There are spots of mucus on the pillow as if from a rotten sack. They rub pork fat with decoctions into him, but his skin spreads like soft paper. He demands that psalms be read over him, although he interrupts them with a hoarse cry. He believes that this purifies him. He does not eat, only drinks warm water with opium. But he does not sleep. The servants refuse to change his linen. One of them, a former groom, said he saw a black crust coming off his tongue. His tongue was cut off in the basement, and he was told not to scream. His body was found in the river 2 days later. The court surgeon, Gauthier Saint-Brieuc, performed another bloodletting, hoping to reduce the fever. From a report to the archbishop, the disease appears to be of a putrid nature. There is suspicion of black throat. When the abscess on his neck was opened, foul-smelling pus gushed out, accompanied by clots of blood. His pulse is weak, his forehead is blotchy, and his nails are blackened. The uvula inside his throat has decomposed to the base. He continues to mumble psalms, even in a state of unconsciousness. He forbade mirrors in the room. He said that it was not him reflected in them, but a demon. He was afraid to sleep. Candles stood around his bed, which the servants were obliged to keep burning day and night. When one of them went out, the maid was executed. He cried out that the angel of death was already at the door. With each passing day, his isolation intensified. Only 2 people had direct access to the room. Bishop Alaphon, and a guard named Martin. The others passed instructions through a wooden window in the wall that had been cut out during the night. His body continued to decay. The skin under his armpits turned blue, and mold grew under his chest. The doctor noted in his report in a dead voice, "The singing continues. He is praying, but he is no longer human. He is rotting flesh with a voice." The accursed heat had not abated for 2 weeks, and according to a Livonian scribe who arrived at the court with notes for the Bishop of Tartu, the whole body of His Holiness exuded a stench as if he had been buried alive. A double ring of guards stood at the monastery gate, not to protect it, but to limit the number of people entering. According to reports from the chamberlain, who was allowed inside for a short time, the walls were so damp that drops of water were falling, and the icons themselves seemed to be crying. Elder Gregor, once one of the dying man's teachers, could now barely approach him, supported by 2 novices. He did not know what was more frightening, the patient's breathing, wheezing psalms through his ravaged throat, or the fact that the patient was still singing, melodiously, pausing when blood began to flow from his larynx. The singer, Lambert, cut a piece of cloth from the banner and held it under his nose. His throat smelled like meat from a crypt, but his lips kept moving. It was not a lesson or a farewell. It was a doomed hum, like an echo in an empty crypt, repeating memorized lines not out of faith, but out of fear. The dying man's face was no longer recognizable under the layer of swelling. His nose was almost flattened, like that of a corpse whose septum had been forgotten to be propped up. His lips, as described in the royal physician's report, were cracked to the black palate. Mucus flowed from the corners, and with each breath, his tongue trembled like a worm on coals. New abscesses appeared on his throat. One of them, the size of a walnut, burst on the morning of the 22nd day, and 2 long clots of blood came out at once. They were placed on a white cloth, and the abbot ordered that they not be removed, so as not to disturb the demon. The physician Gautier, who had arrived from Toulouse, ordered a mustard poultice to be applied to the back of the head and the ear canal to be opened. No blood came out, only pus, cloudy and smelling of urine. The servants stopped sleeping in the adjoining corridor. One of them, a young apprentice from the south, ran away at night and was found hanged on a cross by the cemetery wall. According to rumors, he claimed to have seen the sick man talking to an empty corner, and the corner answering him. The abbot ordered his name to be whitewashed out of the monastery register. At night, the dying man rose from his bed, as described in the report of the Bishop of Constance, and stood in the middle of the room. He was naked, red with fever, and on his chest lay a heavy copper icon, melted at the corner by his body. He read a psalm about purification through suffering, while 2 rats crawled on the floor nearby and gnawed at pieces of his shroud. The guards did not enter. Only the old monk Tybalt approached and covered the body with a blanket. In response, the sick man struck him in the face, not recognizing him. He took him for Satan, the testimony reads. Later, Tybalt was locked in a cell and forbidden to speak. The sick man himself, having lost his voice, whispered the same lines over and over. "Death shall not enter my house until my name is burned out." Meanwhile, a struggle began in the synod. Those who had previously bowed their heads in obedience now demanded that the will be opened, not out of interest, but out of fear. As the ambassador of Naples reported, in the castle, They do not know who to name next, and the name of the deceased has already been removed from the prayers. One of the cardinals, secretly bribed by the Lombards, ordered that part of the letters be rewritten. According to one of the copies, signed in an old hand, the dying man allegedly appointed as his successor, the one who would take out my liver and show that it was still alive. The servants refused to approach the bed without oil bandages on their faces. Even the pharmacy was moved to the basement and ointments were passed through the shutters. The patient's hands were covered with dark brown spots, and gangrene set in on the fifth finger of his right hand. They tried to cut it off with a red-hot knife, not to save him, but to reduce the knocking on the wood when the convulsions began. And all this time, he sang, not loudly, not clearly, but rhythmically. It was as if it was not his body that was suffering, but someone else speaking through his throat. The monk standing guard described it in a note. I think he died long ago. It's just his mouth that continues to serve. The stench from the cell penetrated the choir by the beginning of the fourth week. According to the senior apprentice cook, it was impossible to breathe in the corridor, even with a rag over your face. The monks began to cross themselves at the entrance to the wing, and some burned resin directly in inkwells to drown out the stench a little. However, the removal of the body was still not permitted. The elderly archimandrite, exhausted and eaten away by pus, was still singing. Every day, loudly, relentlessly, through his torn, ulcerated throat. He had not eaten for 7 days. A decoction of onions and cumin flowed from the corners of his mouth, not reaching his throat. His stomach swelled, and in the dim light, it seemed as if something foreign was moving under his skin. His brother Joachim, who was treating him, according to the monastery records, was forced to burn 2 sheets and an apron that was stained with pus from the open sores on his legs and groin. Attempts to cut away the dead tissue were accompanied by inhuman screams, but the archimandrite continued to sing anyway. His voice broke, turned into a cough, and through the crackling of mucus, he still drew out the familiar lines of the Psalms. "Do not forsake me in my old age," wrote the clerk Stephan in his diary. He sings this every day, every hour, as if he knows that no one will hear him except the dead. Only 3 people entered the cell. The others were afraid, not so much of the disease as of what they would see there. 2 brothers who were monks and a servant, a boy of about 12, who had been ordered to pour vinegar on the archimandrite's rotting feet. The boy had bloody snot running from his nose, a clear sign of internal infection, but no one replaced him. "Let him die in service like a saint," said the abbot. His words were included in a report to Bishop Wolf. On the 5th day, black liquid began to flow from the archimandrite's mouth. His face was swollen. His eyelids were stuck together with pus, and his tongue was cracked. He began to sing indistinctly, but the rhythm remained. It got worse. According to one of the brothers, he began to get up at night. Once he was found barefoot in the library, on the floor, in puddles of liquid dripping from his emaciated body. He whispered, "I see them. I see them. They are standing at the altar." He was singing psalms at that moment. The guards forbade anyone to approach his cell within 10 steps. Outsiders were not allowed in. The monastery gates were closed, explaining that the wind was contagious. In reality, the bishops were afraid. Rumors of the visions coming from his mouth reached the episcopate in Mainz. An archimandrite, suffering from necrosis of the larynx, claimed that he could hear dead heretics singing Latin curses in his ear. A doctor sent by the elector refused to enter. "This is not medicine. This is condemnation," he allegedly said at the monastery wall. His name was crossed out of the diaries. According to other records, he later fell ill with heretic's throat, ulcers in the trachea, and clouding of consciousness. He was found dead on the 6th day, with his stomach cut open and a cross in his hand. That evening, a boy died in his cell, a servant who had been washing his feet. His body was not removed until morning. The rumors of singing did not stop. The Archimandrite was still singing. Psalm 39, again and again, he doesn't hear us, he doesn't recognize us, but he continues, as if the devil is asking him not to stop, noted Brother Lavrenti. The smell became unbearable. Rats appeared. In the basement, where herbs were stored, jars of vinegar swelled. All the scribes and copyists were transferred to the neighboring wing. Rumors reached the villages. People said that the Archimandrite had become a living dead man, and that he himself had caused the disease, for burning a woman who had recited psalms in the vernacular 40 years ago. Some claimed that her heart was still kept in the abbey's dungeons. This was denied. But the singing did not stop. The windows in the chambers were covered with thick cloths. The light from the torches smoked on the black walls, and the air, heavy and oily, trembled with mustiness. The bedroom had not been aired for many days. The guards at the entrance stood silently, shifting from foot to foot, as if on the scaffold. 2 doctors, who had been allowed inside in the morning, left the chambers in silence, pale and with trembling hands. One later wrote in his personal notebook, "His tongue was black and swollen to the size of a palm, and his lips were grey, like rotten fish. The body smelled of blood, hot mold, and soap boiled with fat. He no longer spoke. He moaned, as if inside himself. Inside, on a huge bed, lay a man who, just a month ago, had been revered as a saint. Now he was a pile of wet flesh, covered with decaying skin. His face was charred from constant poultices, ointments, and spontaneous bleeding. The sores on his cheeks opened with every movement of his lips, and the prayers muttered through the flesh sounded like the hissing of a wound. His larynx, infected, began to disintegrate. When he sang psalms, it was not words that came out of his throat, but a wheezing, rumbling sound, as if coming from an iron pipe. No one understood the meaning anymore, but no one dared to stop him. 3 monks assigned to his body stood day and night at the foot of his bed, changing the sheets and collecting black mucus in basins. One of them later disappeared without completing his fast. Rumor had it that he had suffocated from the stench and died in the dungeons praying on his knees. His body was never found. The servants, who were only allowed into the chambers wearing gloves, could no longer tell where the bed was and where the body was. The sheets were soaked with juices, fat, and pus. When they tried to light incense in the room, the smell of decay only intensified. One of his close associates, an old confessor, left for Avignon, leaving a note. "I can no longer pray next to this body. This is not death. This is a curse." Meanwhile, a struggle began behind the doors of the chambers. The heir from his first marriage, together with a gathering of old nobility, demanded that the cardinals be summoned. Another, the younger son, supported by the fathers of the monastery of St. Paul, locked up the keys to the treasury and gained access to his father's personal confessions, where he swore to kill heretics for profit. Church lawyers attempted to draw up a will, but each new document was found smeared with feces or vomit. The signature on one of them was later deemed uninterpretable. The apothecary's report said, "He refuses to take any potions. He pulls out the jars of infusions and tears the glass with his fingernails. He has started having convulsions, and as far as I can tell, has gone blind. However, he continues to whisper prayers all the time. It is as if he is singing them not to himself, but to the heavens, begging for mercy. His breathing became irregular. At night, he began to sing louder. The psalms broke into cries. Several times the guards rushed into the room, thinking he was dying, but each time they found him shaking in a pool of his own secretions, with inflamed eyes that no longer closed. The chambers were finally sealed, the curtains were burned, a slab was removed from the wall so that the air could move a little. The monks began to take turns every 2 hours, otherwise they would faint. One of the scribes later wrote, "I heard him singing from the wall. I stood in the corridor and heard him whispering, 'Have mercy on me, Lord,' as if he were whispering directly into my ear. He was alive. He was still alive. For the 4th week in a row, his skin cracked at the slightest touch. By the 5th week, ulcers covered his shoulders, armpits, and groin, giving off a sticky, sour smell. From one of the wounds, a palm-sized clot of pus detached, in which, according to the embalmer monk, something dark, like living tissue, stirred. The surgeon bowed and stepped back, leaving the maid to rub the skin with old wine vinegar until the pus dripped from his feet onto the floor. The ruler's throat was no longer closed. From constant singing, his vocal cords were inflamed, his larynx was swollen, and his breathing was hoarse. Blood flowed from inside, coating the inner wall of his throat. His shirts were changed 3 times a day, all of them soaked with blood, mucus, and the remains of food that he had difficulty swallowing. When the cell shook from his coughing, the maids rushed out. The court chaplain noted in his diary, "God hears his prayers, but cannot bear their sound." There was no air inside. The rooms were not ventilated for fear of drafts and evil winds. The windows were draped with cloth, and the candles were extinguished after sunset. The smell of rot, congealed blood, and phlegm, mixed with incense and resin ointments, hung thick in the air. The court physician never left his bedside. He ordered that his stomach be wrapped in decoctions of wormwood and cinnamon, that the cloth be moistened with lead vinegar, and that the liver area be smeared with warm honey and ashes. Bloodletting was performed daily. The veins on his wrists would not heal. After another puncture, blood flowed mixed with black sludge, to which the surgeon said, "The spleen is rotting like a buried bone." Anatomists argued. Some spoke of internal suppuration, others of a curse. The body could not hold urine. Under the sheets was a thick bedding of straw and herbs, but the mattress was soaked through. Servants took out the chamber pot and poured in ammonia, but the smell remained. Some began to sleep outside the chambers. Rumors spread that worms had already settled inside him. One of the new recruits to the Royal Guard later claimed, "I saw a white larva crawl out of his mouth and fall onto the bed." Guests were no longer allowed in. Even the heir, the eldest son, stood at the door, silent and pale. He was allowed in once and came out covering his mouth with his sleeve. The eldest daughter, a nun, wrote in a letter, "Father has lost his face. His features are melting like wax, and only his voice remains, the voice of a dying God." At night he prayed loudly and incessantly. Sometimes his voice was accompanied by growling, sometimes by laughter. The servants did not dare to answer. One of the guards reported under oath, "On the third night, I heard him whispering in a strange voice. I did not understand the words, but my heart sank. It was not him." The archbishop in charge of confessions arrived at the castle, but spent less than a quarter of an hour in the chambers, after which he refused to administer communion and declared that the papal instructions required silence and complete seclusion. Until the end of the week, no priest dared to enter. Meanwhile, behind the walls of the chambers, a struggle began. The old chancellor insisted on transferring power to his son. The castle commander secretly met with the ambassador of a neighboring duchy. Rumors of a conspiracy multiplied. The capital's advisors demanded reports on the ruler's condition, but there were no answers. All that was passed outside was a single sheet of paper written by the treasurer. "The sovereign is attentive to writing. His speech is strong. His body is weak, but his spirit is alive." A decapitated cook was found in the castle cellars. Rumor had it that he had mixed cinnamon into the ointment intended only for censors. The palace servants said that he sang himself into the grave, and now he sings with his shadow. The outer gates were sealed. The castle chronicler made a note. 50 days have passed, and he is still singing, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes in a voice like the ringing of iron. Everyone held their breath. Death did not come, but its smell was growing stronger. When the psalms stopped, the guards did not immediately realize that the silence meant the end. A servant summoned to the chambers returned as white as wax. No more blood or pus flowed from his throat, only a clot of congealed flesh stuck in his half-open mouth. The deceased's eyes were filled with cloudy bile. The candles were extinguished by the stench. The body was hurriedly carried out through the back passage to avoid a crowd of courtiers, among whom rumors were already spreading that the king had been eaten from within for his sins. 5 pallbearers, barely holding back their vomit, covered the remains with a woolen cloth soaked in vinegar. The skin had peeled off from his feet to the back of his head, and cracks appeared between his ribs. Internal pressure had destroyed his rib cage. Embalming was postponed. The doctors refused to touch the body without the archbishop's permission, and the archbishop locked himself in the refectory and drank incessantly. According to reports from servants, the mob stood along the fence, not crossing themselves or praying, but watching as the coffin with the remains was carried out of the stables. One of the scribes later recorded in the Chronicle, "He who prayed for 40 days was not heard. His coffin was sealed with nails and resin so that it would not crack in the sun." 2 days later, when the body was finally opened for embalming, 2 surgeons lost consciousness. The report of the surgeon, Mart of Reims, noted the liver was completely decomposed, the stomach burst, the lungs were covered with soot and ulcers as if someone had smoked inside. The throat was a continuous ulcer, the larynx was almost rotten, and the mucus had solidified like warm tar. The heart was black, shapeless as if boiled. Traces of antimony were found on the walls of the stomach. Poisoning was suspected. The archdeacon refuted the doctor's opinion. "This corpse is not poisoned by earthly poison, but by the wrath of heaven." He did not repent. He knew the scriptures, but he knew no fear. The court archivist compiled a report on the turmoil in the small council. Within 3 days of his death, 4 different factions claimed the throne. The old nobility accused the new clergy of corrupting the court and destroying the state. The king's young nephew, red-haired and deaf, was taken to a monastery to avoid poisoning. The two brothers of the deceased fled to Spain, claiming that the devil had taken up residence in the tomb. The funeral took place at night. None of the leading dignitaries came out to see the body off. Only 4 monks sang over the broken coffin. According to the chronicler Adelard, the coffin turned black by dawn. A liquid flowed out of a crack in the side as if it contained jelly. The guards did not raise the lid again. They buried it as it was. In the evening of the same day, lightning flashed over the cathedral and shattered the bell. The people took this as a sign. A week later, riots broke out. The townspeople burned 3 houses belonging to the bishopric, accusing the priests of heresy. Charcoal graffiti appeared on the walls. He sang, and we fell silent. Letters sent to Venice and Prague contain the following messages from foreign ambassadors. The French state has no heart. It has been consumed by rot, leaving only a voice that can still be heard in the heads of its servants. The king's death did not purify the throne, but decomposed it along with his body. There is no truth in his songs, only fear. The rot that was in his throat is now in the council. Thus ended the life of a man who prayed for 40 days through a rotting throat, and not a single plea was heard. His death created a vacuum. His voice fell silent, but the stench remained. And in it, power itself began to rot.